Hi, everyone, and welcome to Community Summit in this virtual world. We're really excited to have everyone here and excited to share a little bit of our story today. Today's session is really meant to be a case study. It's on how U.S. venture designed compliant security for T365 for finance and operations, or what is now known as finance and supply chain. Today, you're going to hang out with us for a little while. My name is Chris Katz. I'm a manager with Protiviti in our enterprise application solutions practices, and I focus mainly on security around many different applications, D365 for finance being one of those. I've been doing this for just over 5 years now, and excited to share this story with you. Bob, would you like to give an introduction?
Sure. My name is Bob Arndt. I'm a business analyst at U.S. Venture. I have over 20 years IT experience in a variety of areas. I've really only spent the last year and a half on D365 security configuration administration, and but I've learned quite a bit in that year and a half.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll let you keep rolling.
Sure. U.S. Venture, just to give you a little background, it's a company that's based out of Kimberly, Wisconsin, and it consists of several divisions, which include AutoForce, Oil, Lubricants, Gain, Breakthrough, and iGen. For this case study, though, we're really going to be focusing on U.S. AutoForce. That's the main one that was done for this project.
Perfect. A little background on Protiviti. Protiviti is a global consulting firm. We have a deep expertise across many different areas in internal audit, risk, and financial consulting, as well as a number of things in the enterprise application solutions realm. We are in over 25 countries. We have 85 offices, 6,000 or more professionals, and we're a wholly owned subsidiary of Robert Half. So we have a lot of great backup there as well, in case there's something that we need. I did want to give just a background of our session. You'll probably notice by now, but this session is recorded. The reason that we wanted to do that was so that we can be answering some of the questions and answers as they come in. So no, we are not good enough to be able to look like we're presenting and getting all the content out here and answering questions at the same time, but we wanted to make sure that we had that opportunity to do that. So please do, if you have any questions, put those in the chat, and we're happy to do Q&A there. We'll also reserve some time at the end of this session where we can go live. You can see our smiling faces, and we can start answering some of the questions in a more live format. And the goals of this session, it's a case study, so we want to go through how to build a security framework that is compliant and it fits the business as it grows and matures, and really how we did that for U.S. Venture as a part of their implementation of D365. Just to start off with some framework and some groundwork, a couple of key terms that we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation. Probably the primary one's going to be segregation of duties. So segregation of duties is the concept of one individual not being able to have more access than they need that could potentially result in either fraud or significant financial misstatements or things of that nature. So a common example is going to be maybe the ability to create a vendor and also pay a vendor. You wouldn't want one person to have both of those pieces of access. Otherwise, they might create a vendor with their own bank account and then pay themselves. So that's some of the concept to think about for SODs. A couple of other things to know. Risk is an SOD, so we can use those synonymously. Sensitive access risk is just one side. So maybe you want to know all folks that have the ability to create a vendor, or you want to know everyone that has the ability to create a journal entry or do some sort of setup function. All of those things would be sensitive access. So it's one piece of a risk, and it's just something to keep an eye on. A rule set is the full gamut of risks. So it's a collection of many risks that make up your risk framework within your business. So it's all the different kind of segregation of duties that you might have. And finally, a mitigating control is sometimes you might have to accept a risk. It's part of the business. Maybe you don't have enough people in a certain location to really split up all that functionality. Mitigating control allows you to say, yes, we know that this is a risk that we have, but we're doing this control, as in maybe I'm doing a checklist of everyone that created vendors and everyone that paid them to make sure the same person didn't create a vendor and then also pay the same one. We did want to give a bit of a background on how user access works in D365. And so it's really important. This is for the finance piece of things, and it is a role-based model. So users get their access through a collection of every role that they have assigned to them within their security profile. So a role is a single piece of security access. It's the only thing that you're allowed to assign to a user. And it is a collection of duties and privileges. Typically, we best practice say only assign duties to roles. It's a little simpler that way. You keep this method from highest and greatest to least. If you're looking on the right side, you see the way that it breaks down. So roles are the highest level of the hierarchy. And as you move down, duties are a little bit more granular. Privileges are slightly more granular than duties. And then securable objects is the lowest level. Those include menu items, tables, things of that nature. If you're thinking about what actually gives a user the access to do something, it's a collection of the securable objects. Everything above it is just a vessel and a container that allows you to group things together that do similar things. And that's how the security hierarchy is made up. So something to think about as you go on. We'll talk about some of these concepts, but it's just really important to know how this whole security access piece works. And we'll try to show this image throughout the presentation as well.
The project. So what's the project that we were working on all about? Really, when it comes to the project around U.S. Auto Force was the division. What we were looking for was to add U.S. Auto Force users and additional functionality to the current instance of D365 Finance and Supply Chain that U.S. Venture was currently using. They actually have had an instance in place. They had AX, and that's where the original security was set up. So everything that they have is way back from then. Also, we are looking at specifically creating some SOD rules, implementing those. They did not have anything in place. We wanted some conflict-free task-based roles, and we wanted to map the new users to those roles. And throughout this process, we wanted to have knowledge transfer so that I could do this once Chris leaves.
Perfect. So we did want to share the timeline, and we wanted to share this both in a granular level of how we did the project, but also just in the greater overall scheme of where this fits in the role of implementation. We'll talk about where we put it here, and we'll also at the end probably talk about where we might put it if we did this all over again. So across the bottom, you'll see a couple of the SureStep methodology for how this works. And so you'll notice that the implement is green. We did the security work right before user acceptance testing for the greater implementation as part of US Auto Force. And so that's where this timeline fits in if you're thinking about it along the greater scheme of the implementation. On a high level, we did this in 14 weeks. It might take more or less depending on the size of the organization and how deep dive you want to go into some of these things. And it's important to talk about some of the flow of things. And so that's really more the focus here. And what you'll notice in the way that this presentation goes is we did this in a very particular order for a very particular reason. So we started with the rule set design. The rule set is what gave us all of the risk framework that we needed to stay within in order to know how can we design our roles and what's going to be able to be done and what needs to be split up. So that was the first thing. We also did our role design workshops up front. So it's immediately as you go through the risks, you have your functional folks that know exactly what risks they just talked about. They can design the roles pretty much right then and there, and it helps the design be a little bit more compliant. And it also gives you the ability to know what your framework is that you have to work within or without. It is really important at the end of those design workshops to know that you're going to have follow-up. There is no way around it, especially as part of an implementation when not everyone's completely familiar with those topics, or maybe they don't know every single screen as well as they might know in a system that's been around for 10, 12 years that they've been working within. So that was important. We did have a hiccup in the middle of the project, and so there was a delay. That was a lot around resourcing and making sure that we were getting the appropriate amount of time for the folks that were going to work with us, and also make sure that we're sharing those individuals, because there's many, many other priorities that were going on as part of this implementation, and they also had their day jobs. So it was important to know where we stand and make sure that we got prioritized. After that, we really spent the next couple of weeks making sure that we were re-level setting with the rule set workshops. We also did some business role design or job role design. And so Bob will talk a little bit about that later, but that was trying to make sure that we could make this provisioning process as easy as possible. Following that, we did a couple weeks of role build and user mapping, so determining what users were going to get our new roles, and a facilitated SOD session to make sure that we knew exactly where we stood with any kind of segregation of duties conflicts within our roles. And then finally, the knowledge transfer that Bob was talking about to make sure that the model is sustainable and that this doesn't have to happen again for a very, very long time, hopefully never. A bit about the rule set. So I alluded earlier to the fact that the rule set is really the standard piece of what enables us to say, this is what we can do and this is what we cannot do. It's the ground rules for this kind of project. We tackled this in 3 different phases. The first was conducting rule set workshops to review the SOD risks with key business process owners, with audit, and also with IT. We did start with Protiviti's leading practice recommendations for a rule set. That said, many different tools, FastPath included, there's other ones out there as well, they come with a rule set that will give you a good starting point, so you don't have to start from scratch. Also, I mentioned that we did this with the business process owners, audit, and IT. We found that the greatest success is when you get those 3 people in the room. Security is not an IT project. It's not just a business project, and it's not just an audit project. You have to have all 3 of those folks and groups in the room in order to make the right decision. The second piece of this was gathering feedback from each of the business process owners, because they're the ones that are going to own the risks, and they're the ones that can make the right decision on, oh, this is really important to us, or maybe this is something that we just don't do at all. And finally, we consolidated that feedback and we built it into a custom rule set within FastPath. FastPath was the SOD tool of choice. It lets us do a lot of things, including looking at the risks that users have, the risks that are within roles. There's some other various functionality that we leveraged as well, and we'll talk about that throughout the course of the project in this presentation, but we wanted to make sure that was built in the FastPath so that we had something that as we were building the roles, we could measure the SOD risk against. I've alluded to rule set and risks a couple of times, and so we wanted to make sure that we knew exactly how to explain what this is and give you a visual. So a SOD rule set is a collection of segregation of duties risks. For this particular project, we had a right around 70. If you include finance pieces or things like that, the rule set can easily become much, much larger than that. It really depends on the size of your organization, how risk tolerant you are, and other factors such as those. As you get down lower, and I'm looking at the branches now, it's 2 business processes, maybe 3 or 4 that conflict against each other. So the example that I like to use, because it's the easiest to grasp, is being able to maybe create a vendor and being able to pay a vendor. So those might be 2 separate business processes. And you might not want to have any one user have the ability to do both of those things. Underneath those business processes, this is where the finance side of things or the technical side meets the business side. So the business understands what create a vendor means. The securable objects that go into that business process, though, are each of those menu items or each of those tables that allows a user to actually create a vendor or to actually pay a vendor. So that's the breakdown. One really important thing to know here is that there are tools out there such as FastPath, which is what we used, that looks for SOD risk at the securable object level. Although the out-of-the-box rule set and the out-of-the-box SOD tool does exist within D365, it actually looks up here at the duty level. And so if you're manipulating any of the duties or creating new ones, it might not know exactly what those risks are. They might be inaccurate unless you have a really, really strong change management process. So the recommendation would be to look down at the securable object level for your SOD risks. All right, building the rule set. We thought it was important to show you, we've talked about the tool, and so we thought it was important to show you what the tool looks like. This particular one has a couple of different pieces, but what we're showing here is the conflict rule set. So there's a out-of-the-box rule set in many tools. FastPath is not the only one, but it is a good place to start. It comes with a number of conflicts out of the box. And so if you're looking to start somewhere and you don't have a consulting firm or something like that, or a practice or rule set that you have out of the box or have developed over time, this can be a great place to start. And you'll notice the breakdown of here are the conflicts and here's the business processes. So there's many, many of these that we built in. Jumping into the role architecture, we thought it was important to have a 4-tier approach, and this is something that Protiviti does normally. And as you design your roles, it can be really, really difficult to understand what that role is giving if there isn't some sort of architecture or maintenance or role naming procedure and policy. So part of this, and I'll let Bob tell the rest of it, but is to have a 4-tiered approach. So anything that was tier 4 was critical access or setup access. That means that it has something to do with what is enabled in the setup part of each of the modules. So that's usually very, very sensitive. And so we want to make sure we know exactly who has that and what roles would be granting that. The next, tier 3, is update access. So it lets you make some sort of change. Maybe you can create a vendor, maybe you can create a journal entry, you can maintain something, something of that nature. Tier 2 is display only or reporting only access. So you can just view things, you can click a report and let that run. Things like that aren't going to create any segregation of duties issues because you're not actually doing anything. But it is really important, especially for a lot of your managers and things like that, to have display access that goes all the way across different modules. The bottom of the tier is your general end user access. Many times this is system user. For most people it is. But I have seen some people that want a little bit more than just the system user access. And so maybe they make a copy of system user and they just give it to everyone. Or give like a couple more pieces of information. And this is for all users. It's their basic amount of access they need in order to just get access and have like just a very basic functionality to do things in D365.
All right, types of roles. Really, when we did workshops, we focused on 2 types of roles, not just one, and they were broken up accordingly. If you look at the visuals here, you can see we have a task-based security role and a job-based security role. Really, the job-based security role is made up of the task-based. So what we did first is we had pulled together the stakeholders, and we had talked about what would this inventory clerk John Doe, what would he do? What are the tasks that he would need to perform? And those were things like we show here, like display inventory reports and inquiries, which is made up of things like viewing shipments and viewing on-hand lists. And then we had some maintain stuff that John Doe would do. Now, if you notice, we did keep the views and maintain separate. We wouldn't want to combine those. And the purpose of that is for example, we might want to not only provide the ability to have a manager request a job role, but they also might want the ability to request some, not all, of the task roles. Say you have an employee that is going to be helping out for a little bit. It is nice to be able to have them to be able to just request the ability to do a maintain function, and in addition to their existing role, and you would have somebody approve that, and then they would just have this tiny little piece of access, not an entire job role. But then what we did is we would take the person, John Doe, or the inventory clerk, and we would say, hey, what task roles does that job involve? And that is where we combine, as you can see under inventory clerk, the task roles that that job role would have. The next slide we're going to talk about is the naming conventions. Now, naming conventions is pretty important. I mean, we had, when it came to the job roles, we had everything start with USV to show that it was a custom job role, not out of box. And it's important too that if you are creating a job role from an out-of-box job role, that you copy it. You do not change the out-of-box role. You want to make sure you have the original the way it was, and you don't mess with it. So yeah, you're going to want to make sure you give that job role a meaningful name, not something like AP Extra Special Supervisor. It doesn't really give you much background of what that is and what does extra special mean. But we had stuff like USV pricing analyst and USV sales clerk and things like that. But the slide here really focuses on the task role naming convention, which, as you can see in the upper left, we started out with the USV to show that it was a custom. And then the next part we would have is the module abbreviation. You can see on the right, we have different examples of the different module abbreviations. And the module abbreviations, keep in mind that you might be able to access a certain module from different, from other modules. It might be like a sub-menu item in D365, but we really want to focus on what is the main module that that view or functionality exists in. So that would be the second part. And then we would do the read update setup. That's just basically saying what is the function that this task role is performing. And then the last part is really a brief descriptor of what that task is. And you can see at the bottom, there's some examples of what those are, some of the finished products as that we came up with. And they all do have role descriptions. So even though we have a nice complete descriptive name, you still want to include a role description in there for future people that are going to be working on those roles and adding them. Also, if you are having any one of these task roles accessible for requests by managers, just having that name isn't enough. You're going to want that description in there so that they know what they're requesting.
Absolutely. So we did want to share a couple of the tips and tricks that we use to do the role build and identify what kind of objects and what to put in there. So over the next couple slides, we'll talk about some of those tips and what's available out of the box. The first and maybe the most leveraged one that we had was the security diagnostics tool. This is a fantastic tool. You can see basically you navigate to any screen that you would like to give to a user. And from that point, you can go to options in the top, and under page options, you'll see a button for security diagnostics, a menu item. You can click on that and you'll get this nice box over here that tells you, here are all the roles that have access to this page, here are all the duties, and here are all the privileges. You actually will see that we have some custom in here. It starts with a Z in this case, but it could start with USB. And it's a nice way to see, okay, these are the options that I have for as I'm doing a role build, these are the duties or the privileges, and I can pick one of these. Or maybe there aren't any that are custom and you want to manipulate them. You can use these to start with and make your copy from one of them. A couple of other tips and tricks. If you're looking at the URL at the very top of your screen, there actually is a lot of gibberish up there, but it actually all makes sense. And there's some important stuff at the very far right. And so you can see what company that you're in as far as if it's the original, the company accounts data, DAT, or others as well. You can also see the menu item. So if you see MI equals here, that does correlate to the menu item that you're currently looking at on that page. And there's other ones for menu item display or menu item output or action. So that is another place you can look. A third place that you might want to be able to leverage is the task recording option. So if you're looking at your screen, you can look at the top right, there's a gear, and then there's an option for task recorder. You can start a task recording by creating a recording, naming it, and then recording yourself, go through a series of actions. So maybe you want to create a role that has the ability to view vendors. So you're going to go to accounts payable and then view vendors. And then you also want it to be able to see purchase orders. So maybe you might go to procurement and sourcing and click on all purchase orders to see what's there. This task recording will take and capture all of the menu items that are required that it bounces up against. And you can create a role if you'd like, or a privilege or something like that to be able to do both of those things. There's also an opportunity within a tool that we use, FastPath, where we could upload our security recordings, and it would tell us here are the roles, the privileges, and all of the duties and things of that nature that have what you're looking for and how many of those objects.
On this one here, this was a lesson learned for me actually, and we'll talk about this later when it came to giving our users system admin access to be able to play around in the screens. But they were really used to just seeing all these menu items when they went in, and when we asked them what they needed, they were like, "Yeah, we want this view." And so we went into security diagnostics and found out the duties and privileges and gave them the duties and privileges for this view. But one thing you need to remember is that that doesn't necessarily give you all the security access to all the menu items. You will need to go into each one of these tabs and menu items and give them access to those as well by clicking on it, going and doing security diagnostics on each one of those. Some of them even access our shortcuts to other modules. So you're going to want to make sure you do that. Also, just because it's there with system admin doesn't mean they're going to use it. So make sure you're asking the good old, my business analysis background, get those needs up front to find out what they actually want to do, and then provide the security around that. Don't just give them the entire kitchen and then take away everything later. Kind of makes them a little upset. So.
The third piece of what we wanted to do, and it was important for us to do, was knowledge transfer and putting governance in place. So as we built these rules and these rule sets, that they would be maintainable in the long term. It's not a one-time project that loses its benefit. So a couple of the things that we did, we first thought it was important, and know it's important, to establish ownership over both the roles that we were building and also the rule set risks that we created. As the business grows, or as D365 releases new features, those might need to be incorporated into the rule set or incorporated into the roles. And so we established a role change management procedure. So if a role needs to change or a process, it goes through all the right steps. So as new functionality comes in, you get process owner agreeing that, yes, this is a change I want to make to the role. So it's an active process and an active thing that they can review. Beyond that, it has to go through the right segregation of duties checks to make sure that the role isn't going to have any conflicts. It's important to keep those roles conflict free as much as you can, because that's what gets assigned to users. So if the role is a conflict, your user is automatically going to get it there as well. We also gave a lot of advice for how to go through UAT and some gotchas from UAT to stay ahead of time. But this governance process was really, really important. Another piece that we used is a tool within FastPath for managing all of access within D365. So the tool is called Identity Manager. It allows you to coordinate the process of a user requesting a piece of access or you giving the piece of access, getting the right sign off from your role owners and your user managers, if that's the case. If you making sure that you run those requests through SOD. So ahead of time, you can identify if this user is going to have a risk or not, and eventually assigning that to users. So this was another important part, so that you're staying ahead of the SOD piece as opposed to finding it after the fact. And a couple of the things that we had as the results from our project. So we had a rule set of 70 risks. Again, these are non-finance risks. And they run the gamut of different kind of importance. So we appropriately ranked them. We involved 11 different process owners in the decision-making process. We found that although we started with a lot of medium risks, we found that there were 11 that were actually critical, and then all the way around the circle to 13 that just weren't relevant for U.S. venture, and specifically for U.S. auto, of course. We did leave those as ignore. That way, if they needed them in the future, that they were going to be there for them. And so you can just mark them, you can turn them on, make them high or medium or whatever the appropriate thing is for that.
When it came to the new role metrics, we did have 83 new custom task roles. Again, that was for AutoForce. And then we had 15 new job roles that we created. And we had about an average of 8 tasks per job role. Also, we did have some of those task roles that we did have that could be accessible on their own, but not all 83. You don't want that. When it came to the SOD rules being run against the roles themselves, it ended up we had 0 critical and 0 high, which is very impressive. Just as a comparison, I did, after this, run these rules up against our current AX grandfathered roles, and we had a lot of critical and highs, which we're still working through. But it really showed that this was a better way of going about things and what way we're going to go in the future. When it came to the mapping metrics, one thing I want to say about this, we do have the numbers here, but it's really important to have the user mapping done closer to implementation, especially in our case when we had U.S. AutoForce, which we have a lot of warehouses, and there's a lot of employees coming and going into different roles into the company, to the point where it's almost changing on a daily basis. So for us to do this even a month before implementation would have resulted in a lot of rework. So even though these numbers here are pretty high, we didn't really get too picky with the data because we knew that the information was, we did this activity, but we knew that the information was going to be changing. So we didn't get really too picky with what was there. But you're going to have to really think through the timing of this activity. When it comes to challenges, I'm going to focus on the first one here. One thing we did, and what we found out was that we were really having an issue competing for business resources, especially when it came to the fact that a lot of these people were management when it came to the role owners, and management's time is limited as it is, and they also were involved in the other parts of the project. So that was one thing that we had as a challenge for sure from beginning to end.
Also, we alluded to this a bit earlier. We did have some limited business familiarity with the application. So as the implementation was ongoing, we had some folks that were really, really techie and they wanted to drill into all the details, and they've had an opportunity to do that. But because this wasn't this primary system that everyone was using, there was a lot of acclimation that was still happening. And when we were asking some of the questions, it might take some additional time to go back and for that process owner to really get a feel for what actually we're talking about. So going back in, clicking around a little bit, trying to understand what the question is and if that report was something that they needed or wasn't. Also, the way that the risk process. So that was definitely another challenge that we ran into and something to make sure that you build in time for. The third was, I know this was particularly painful for Bob, but a lot of the stakeholders were so accustomed to having system administrator access. And so they knew what everything looked like. And it was quite difficult to take this away from a number of the users. So when you start with everything, it's harder to take it away than it is to start them with a more kind of limited subset of the roles that they would actually be doing in their day-to-day jobs. And so that was another lesson learned for us is maybe don't start with system administrator access. And I'm sure Bob can tell stories for days about interactions he had with some of the folks that were really, really, really tethered to that.
When it came to lessons learned, we'll try to get through these quickly so that you have time for questions at the end. The first one there, I'll cover the top row. We had a lesson that when it comes to out-of-box roles, they do not really restrict to least privilege access. So a user can get more than they need in resulting, uh, basically when you run the SOD rules against them, you're going to get more violations when you're using out of box. So it's, I mean, the example I had about our AX roles is a good example of that, which are more based on out of box. And you're better off to start with, less and then add on to it to help with that. The second and third one is something that I ran into a couple months ago when it came to, we were adding the enterprise credit management suite onto our system, and we found that some of these new add-ons or new functionality already have the access added onto them already in duties, privileges, out-of-box roles. And as soon as we turned that on, all of a sudden users that we didn't know had access were getting access. So you're going to want to make sure you test out all that stuff before you flip the switch, because you might need to turn stuff off. And especially if you're using out of box and not copies, and you're not starting with the, as we said, the least privilege access, it's going to give you more than you anticipated. The last one there was just really around, I have a lot of users that focus on the fields, and getting them to focus more on the process instead of the fields. If they really, I mean, you can restrict field access, but it does take away the integrity of your SODs, really, when it comes to giving too much field restrictions on their security.
Yeah, the field security can also have performance impacts if you're not really careful with it. So it's another thing to keep in mind is what are you trying to restrict? How often is that going to be accessed, and how much system processing power are you willing to allocate to something like that? So certainly things to keep in mind. Sponsorship is one of the most important things that we had during the course of the project, and making sure that management is bought in and they're aware of what we were trying to do and why it's important. Those are the folks that are going to be able to prioritize tasks and time for a lot of those stakeholders that are going to be part of the project, like your functional leads, things like that. It's also going to be important to remove roadblocks. So inevitably things will come up, and having the right buy-in, those people are going to be able to say, this is important, this is something that has to get done, and that's what moves your project along and keeps you on the timeline. The second piece is that communication is an absolute necessity. You're going to be working with many people across the business, and keeping their attention and also keeping them informed is really, really crucial to making sure that they know what is coming up. Here's what's going to be expected of me. Here's the time that it's going to be expected of that person. Making sure that they're aware of how much time do I need to dedicate to this? And so that they can bring up conflicts or anything like that, vacations, well ahead of time, so you can plan around those type of things. The last is that security is not an IT focused topic. It's just not. It works the best when you get members of the business, when you get folks from IT, and when you get members of audit to all come to the room together and work together to find something that is going to work for the business long term. It has the right risks that are enabled. It has the right business functionality enabled. And so just getting all those things in the right place is really, really crucial for this. We do want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A. So at this point, we're just going to hand it over. We've hopefully been answering questions throughout the chat, but we're going to just open this session up, and we'll present live, and we'll answer some of the questions or harp on some things that we thought were important.